History paints Arabia before Islam as desert tribes feuding over camels. But just north in Syria, the chaos was on another level. Monks perched on 30-foot pillars for decades, emperors editing God's resume like bitter interns, and mobs torching churches over a single vowel in a Greek word. This wasn't Sunday school Christianity. This was Syria's so-called Golden Age, bishops strutting through palaces, holy men reinvented as influencers before Wi-Fi, and Antioch sacked so often it might as well have filed for witness protection. By the time this Christian empire crumbled, Syria wasn't a promised land. It was a Netflix password, passed around, abused, and finally broken. So buckle up, because this isn't the story you were told. We're digging into the parts they'd rather you forget. Now, before we begin, smash that like button, subscribe for more absurd deep dives into the past, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Syria was never background scenery. It was the hinge of the ancient world, where deserts blurred into farmland, caravan trails spilled into ports, and temples, markets, and fortresses piled on top of each other like layers of unfinished history. To control Syria wasn't just to hold land, it was to sit astride the switchboard of empires. On one side stood Rome and later Byzantium, armored in legions and tax codes. On the other loomed Persia, with cavalry, silk, and an endless appetite for payback. And jammed between them sat Syria, the unlucky prize in a tug-of-war that never ended. Geography was destiny, and Syria's destiny was to be fought over until it bled. Why the obsession? Fertile fields that could feed an army, trade routes pulsing with silk, spices, and silver, sacred shrines that pulled in pilgrims from across continents. Syria wasn't just wealthy, it was symbolic. Whoever ruled it could claim authority not only over trade, but over faith itself. That made it irresistible and doomed at the same time. For the people living there, politics felt like a rigged game. Each emperor promised stability, but the script never changed. New banners, new taxes, charred beams, and empty streets. Imagine rebuilding your roof after one invasion, only to have the next army tear it down before the mortar set. For Syrians, empires changed like one bad landlord after another, repainting the walls, raising the rent, and leaving the plumbing broken. And the cost was brutal. Families were uprooted with every campaign. Captives marched east into Persia or west into Roman colonies. Slave markets filled with Syrians who, just a year before, had been free citizens. Deportation wasn't punishment, it was policy. Conquerors treated the population like spare parts, shipped wherever the empire needed bodies. Yet life clawed back. Antioch's stalls reopened, farmers sowed fresh seed, and bishops resumed their bickering as though nothing had happened. The cycle always reset, until the next war rolled through. For Syrians, destruction wasn't an exception, it was the baseline, as predictable as the changing seasons. But centuries of churn carved more than resilience, they bred cynicism. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered in every marketplace and monastery. After generations of being trampled by foreign boots, Syrians were exhausted, skeptical, and ripe for something new. The stage was set for the next act, when battles over borders would bleed into battles over God. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century, Syria should have been the big winner. Antioch, the empire's eastern jewel, suddenly became a Christian power center. The city that once echoed with pagan chants now roared with psalms, and bishops strutted like governors, wielding authority over both souls and streets. Religion wasn't just tolerated, it was trending. But with prestige came pressure. Christianity wasn't a tidy package, it was a theological minefield. Was Christ divine, human, both, or some impossible fusion? The arguments were endless, and Syria sat right on the fault line. Antioch's bishops sparred with rivals in Alexandria, and every council turned into a verbal gladiator match where a single word could tip empires into chaos. The result was what you might call the heresy Olympics. First came the Arians, insisting Christ was divine but not quite equal to God the Father. Then the Nestorians, dividing Christ into two persons, like a celestial odd couple sitcom, one divine, one human, no one agreeing on who paid rent. And finally, the Monophysites, who doubled down on Christ having a single divine nature. Each faction claimed to be defending the faith, and damned the rest as heretics fit for exile, or worse. These weren't ivory tower debates. Sermons spilled into street brawls, mobs armed with sticks and stones chanting theology like fight songs. Picture Eagles fans in priestly robes smashing furniture over Christ's nature. A bishop could go from saint to exile in a single council vote, hauled off like contraband and dumped in some distant province. Emperors, instead of cooling the tension, jumped right in. Constantine's successors tried to play referee, but each imperial decree only stoked more fury. One emperor leaned Arian, another swung back to orthodoxy, and with every shift Syria's churches burned. In theory, emperors were shepherds of the flock. In practice, they were bouncers setting fire to the club. For ordinary Syrians, the experience was whiplash. Yesterday's priest might be today's outlaw. Churches were shuttered, then reopened, then smashed again by soldiers enforcing the latest theological fashion. Faith was no longer comfort. It was a political hazard. You could lose your home, your livelihood, or your head depending on whether you believed Christ had one nature or two. And yet, people threw themselves into the struggle. Theology became identity, destiny, survival. The empire's obsession with tiny turns of doctrine carved deep scars into Syria. By the late 5th century, the region wasn't a Christian paradise but a battlefield of competing truths, where devotion and violence walked hand in hand. What began as Constantine's triumph quickly rotted into Syria's torment, a holy empire where God's job description was constantly redrafted, and the ink was always blood. As Syria reeled from theological riots and imperial decrees, another display of extremity emerged: the rise of holy men who treated faith like an endurance stunt. If bishops fought with words and emperors fought with fire, ascetics fought with their own flesh, turning suffering into public theatre. The most famous was Simeon Stylites, a monk who climbed atop a pillar outside Aleppo and refused to come down. Not for a week, not for a year, but for 37 years. Rain, sun, wind, vermin, he endured it all while villagers craned their necks to catch his sermons. He wasn't a preacher in a pulpit, he was a human antenna, broadcasting from a stone tower to the desert below. His followers? They didn't leave likes, they left livestock. Other ascetics, unwilling to be outshined, devised their own extremes. Some locked themselves in caves, others wore chains that rusted into their flesh, and a few rolled through thorn bushes until they looked like human pincushions. Holiness became a contest of spectacle, a competition where the trophy was sainthood and the arena was pain. Crowds adored it. Devotees journeyed across miles of dust just to stare at these skeletal men, as if proximity to misery leaked holiness. Parents hoisted sick children up to be blessed by saints who hadn't bathed in decades. Relics weren't just bones anymore. Even scraps of clothing or blood-soaked rags were prized, tokens of a grace measured in sweat and sores. But devotion turned feral. Crowds sometimes mobbed ascetics, clawing away garments or even patches of skin as souvenirs. Infants were left at the feet of pillars, abandoned in hope of blessing or adoption. Faith became commerce in agony, a market where pain, filth, and sacrifice were currency. Villagers and pilgrims couldn't decide if they were witnessing miracles or madness. The same empire that couldn't keep roads safe now exalted men wobbling between heaven and earth on platforms barely wider than a dinner plate. Saints were proclaimed proof of divine favor, yet to skeptics, they looked more like sideshow acts than saviors. And still, their influence was immense. Visitors carried home tales of men who defied hunger, gravity, and sanity. Bishops invoked their feats as proof that holiness rooted itself in Syrian soil. Even emperors dispatched envoys to consult these ragged scarecrows in the sky, desperate for legitimacy from men who hadn't touched the ground in decades. By the 5th century, sainthood itself had become performance art, measured not by wisdom or compassion, but by how spectacularly you could dismantle your own body in public. If saints turned holiness into performance art, emperors turned doctrine into law enforcement. For Syria, the 5th century wasn't just about faith, it was about imperial decrees stamped like cattle brands. Doctrine was no longer debated in churches, it was handed down like arrest warrants, enforced by armies. The climax came at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, where bishops, under imperial supervision, declared Christ to be both fully human and fully divine in one person. On paper, it was a compromise meant to end the scripture deathmatch. In practice, it was like announcing half the empire had just been cut from the playoffs. Monophysite Syrians, who clung to the one nature view, saw it as betrayal. Rome wasn't in the mood for nuance. Soldiers stormed non-compliant churches, installing loyal bishops like imperial ventriloquist dummies. Priests who resisted were beaten, exiled, or killed. Dogma had been militarized, and Syria was told to conform or burn. To everyday believers, it was disorienting. Imagine a government official knocking on your door, not to collect taxes, but to interrogate you on Christ's dual natures. Answer wrong, and your parish might be torched by imperial troops. Belief wasn't salvation anymore, it was survival through doctrinal trivia. Emperors styled themselves as gatekeepers of doctrine, but acted more like theology cops with crowns, deciding who was in, who was out, and sometimes torching the whole place to prove a point. Christianity wasn't preached, it was policed. The backlash was brutal. Riots erupted across Syrian cities as locals resisted Constantinople's chokehold. Antioch, once the jewel of the East, turned into a battlefield where mobs fought over creeds while soldiers swung swords in the name of orthodoxy. To dissent was to risk exile, mutilation, or death. And still, the empire escalated their grip. Each emperor inherited not just a throne, but the role of part-time theologian. They weren't satisfied guarding borders. They wanted to rewrite heaven itself. By the late 5th century, Syria had become a laboratory for state-enforced religion, a province where emperors claimed to defend the faith while leveling sanctuaries, silencing dissent, and bleeding the land dry. The dream of a Christian empire had curdled into a theological police state, and Syria was suffocating at its center. If doctrine didn't break Syria, geography made sure the punishment never stopped. For centuries, the land became the chessboard where Rome and Persia slugged it out, a tug of war with no finish line and no concern for the people caught in the middle. Persian armies stormed in from the east, Roman legions countered from the west, and Syria became the no-man's land of every campaign. Antioch, Damascus, Edessa, names that should conjure thriving cities instead, became trophies to be paraded, stripped, and fought over again. A town could change masters multiple times before a child grew to adulthood. The devastation was relentless. Cities were sacked, populations marched into slavery, and harvests ground into dust beneath cavalry hooves. Families were split not by choice but by deportation, scattered east and west like spoils. For peasants, loyalty was geography. Whichever army showed up that morning decided your empire. Antioch bore the worst of it. Captured, razed, and repopulated so often its ruins had ruins. Chroniclers describe Persians herding its citizens east like cattle, only for Byzantines to later drag in replacements. If a city could develop trauma, Antioch lived with it. From the ground, war wasn't news. It was daily routine. Armies bivouacked in your fields, temples doubled as fortresses, and markets collapsed under the weight of emergency taxes that never expired. The original subscription service, but with soldiers instead of customer support. Survival meant repainting your allegiance, Persian tax stamps one day, Byzantine orders the next. Both empires claimed to be Syria's rightful guardians. Persia flaunted its ancient prestige, Byzantium, its Christian mandate. Yet to those enduring it, the view never changed. Another army demanding grain, another levy piled on, another season of empty granaries and broken walls. Imperial glory translated into bare cupboards. The absurdity was that both fought as if Syria were the crown jewel, yet by the time either held it, the land was stripped bare. Winning Syria was like inheriting a palace after it had already been chopped up for firewood. By the early 7th century, after centuries of raids, sackings, and forced migrations, Syria was fertile but weary, faithful but scarred. For its people, war wasn't victory or defeat, it was weather, and the forecast never changed. If war drained Syria's body, relics fattened its soul and its economy. By the 5th and 6th centuries, Damascus and Edessa had turned martyrdom into a full-time trade. Bones, blood, scraps of clothing, all became tokens of divine power. Salvation was no longer just preached. It was packaged, transported, and sold. Shrines multiplied across the land. In Edessa, the supposed image of Christ, not made by human hands, drew pilgrims who poured in silver as eagerly as prayers. In Damascus, holy tombs rivaled bazaars for traffic, sometimes outshining them. Faith wasn't just devotion, it was industry, and every city wanted its share of the miracle economy. The relic trade was ruthless. Monks crept into rival monasteries to dig up bones, the closest thing late antiquity had to corporate espionage. Entire corpses vanished under cover of night, only to resurface in new shrines with suspiciously polished miracle stories. Possession was 9/10 of the law, and all of the holiness. Madness wasn't a side effect, it was the selling point. Chroniclers describe relic water, pilgrims drinking from cisterns steeped with saintly bones, convinced it cured sickness. Others bought dust from martyrs' tombs, mixing it into bread or medicine. One church even baptized converts in bone-soaked water, as if grace could be brewed like herbal tea. But behind the piety lurked suspicion. Rivals accused each other of counterfeits, relics faked with animal bones or worse. A sheep femur parading as an apostle's thigh was no unheard of scam. And every shrine doubled as a rumor mill. Relics that healed in one city were whispered to curse in another, depending on your faction. For the poor, it was both lifeline and farce. Families pawned their last coins for a vial of holy oil or a scrap of cloth, desperate for healing. Meanwhile, monasteries stacked offerings in treasure rooms heavy with incense, while preaching the virtues of poverty. Renunciation rang from the pulpit, accumulation rattled in the cellars. Edessa leaned fully into the carnival of faith, parading bones through the streets with musicians blaring and vendors hawking charms. Relics marched alongside livestock and street food, holiness woven into the fabric of civic spectacle, half sacrament, half halftime show. By the 6th century, Syria's identity was a paradox. Cities staggered from invasions, yet shrines bulged with offerings. Villages went hungry, but reliquaries gleamed with silver. Faith had been monetized, death made portable, and Syria's most reliable export was holiness bottled, boxed, and occasionally forged. If relics turned death into commerce, Byzantine bureaucracy turned life into paperwork. By the 6th century, Syria wasn't just invaded by armies, it was invaded by accountants. Constantinople perfected the art of squeezing coins from peasants until the empire bled silver. Taxes weren't seasonal, they were eternal, a constant pressure that bent daily life out of shape. For families on the ground, survival often meant impossible choices. Chroniclers record Syrians selling children into slavery to cover tax arrears, a grim arithmetic where debt erased parenthood. The bureaucracy didn't care. To the empire, a child was just another asset, if not a taxpayer today, then collateral tomorrow. The system was deliberately cruel. Levies arrived in layers: land tax, crop tax, trade tax, church tax, and the occasional crisis imposition that outlived the crisis by decades. Inspectors prowled villages like predators, counting goats and bushels with the zeal of modern auditors. But armed with soldiers instead of calculators, the IRS with swords and incense. Damascus, wealthy and cosmopolitan, bore the brunt of Byzantine appetite. Its merchants groaned under tariffs that drained profits from the Silk Road caravans. Aramaic-speaking peasants in the countryside, meanwhile, resented Greek-speaking officials who pocketed bribes while demanding back taxes. The gap between elite and village widened until the empire looked less like protector and more like parasite. And the worst part? Tax receipts became more valuable than faith. A stamped parchment from Constantinople might protect your family longer than baptism or relics. Salvation in Syria didn't just come from saints, it came from paperwork filed correctly and on time. The bitterness spread. To the urban poor, monks and bishops squabbled over theology, while imperial agents measured fields for taxation. To farmers, the difference between a Byzantine official and a Persian collector was negligible. Both spoke foreign tongues, both demanded grain, both left villages poorer than before. Over time, oppression reshaped loyalty. Many Syrians came to see Persia not as enemy but as reprieve. If Persia hated Constantinople, that was good enough. Resistance brewed quietly, not in grand revolts but in whispered prayers, unpaid levies, and hidden grain stores. The empire mistook silence for obedience, never realizing its subjects were already halfway gone. By the eve of the Arab conquests, Syria's peasants weren't clinging to Constantinople, they were aching for release. A system that bled them dry in the name of faith and empire had done its work too well. Beneath the weight of Byzantine bureaucracy, resentment festered like kindling, waiting for the next match to spark it into flame. By the 6th century, Syria's theological disputes stopped being arguments and started looking like civil war. Doctrinal lines hardened into battle lines, and monasteries that once preached peace turned into fortified compounds. Faith wasn't just professed, it was armed. The Monophysites, enraged by Constantinople's Chalcedonian decrees, entrenched themselves across Syria's countryside. What had begun as dissent hardened into resistance. Bishops marshaled mobs, monks drilled novices with cudgels, and cloisters stockpiled weapons as if scripture came with an armory. Heresy wasn't whispered anymore. It was shouted through clenched teeth while swinging clubs. Street clashes erupted in Antioch, Damascus, and Edessa alike. Monks brawled in alleys, mutilating rivals as if theology demanded trophies. Eyewitnesses record processions turning into riots, chants of one nature or two, punctuated by flying stones and shattered icons. Civil war didn't need foreign armies. It brewed in the cloisters. Absurdity thrived in the violence. Monasteries became recruitment halls, where novices sang psalms by day and practiced stick fighting by night. Rival factions vandalized churches with graffiti declaring rival creeds, ancient Syria's version of Twitter flame wars, except the posts burned in real time. Even relics were weaponized. Saintly bones stolen to demoralize enemies, holy objects turned into spoils of war. For villagers and merchants, the chaos blurred into nightmare. Marketplaces were patrolled not by city guards but by partisan mobs. To pray in the wrong church was to risk being beaten, arrested, or worse. The empire's promise of order had curdled into gang warfare over adjectives, leaving peasants caught in the theological crossfire. Emperors, far from calming the storm, only stoked it. Attempts to enforce orthodoxy drove dissent underground, where it festered hotter. Each exile of a Monophysite leader only bred martyrs. Each crackdown on heresy turned villages into rebel strongholds. The state couldn't stamp out dissent, it only fertilized it. By the late 6th century, Syria's faith had fractured beyond repair. Theology had ceased to be a debate and become a battlefield, one where scripture flew as battle flags and monasteries doubled as barracks. It was no longer Rome versus Persia, but Christian versus Christian. Each convinced God himself backed their stones and spears. By the early 7th century, the long Cold War between Rome and Persia ignited into its bloodiest round yet. The spark came in 602, when Emperor Maurice of Byzantium was murdered, and his killer, Phocas, seized the throne. Persia claimed revenge on behalf of Maurice, but vengeance was just the excuse. What followed was less a war than an apocalypse staged in Syria. Khosrow II of Persia unleashed his armies westward, not in raids, but in rolling conquest. Cities toppled one after another: Edessa, Damascus, even Jerusalem. In 614, Persian troops stormed the holy city, pulling down churches and carting off treasures. Among the loot was Christianity's holiest prize, the true cross, ripped from its shrine and paraded east like a hostage. For Syria, it was humiliation beyond plunder, God's own symbol taken captive. The devastation was total. Chroniclers describe sanctuaries razed, clergy slaughtered, and civilians butchered or enslaved in staggering numbers. Villages were stripped bare in mass deportations. Whole populations marched into Persia as living spoils. Syria wasn't just the battlefield, it was the trophy dismembered in plain sight. Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor who replaced Phocas, answered with a counteroffensive so desperate it bordered on madness. Between 622 and 628, he rallied what was left of his empire, striking back across Anatolia into Persian lands. His campaigns clawed back Jerusalem, reclaimed relics, and forced Persian troops from Syria. On parchment, it was victory. In reality, it was triumph carved from exhaustion. The cruel punchline was that neither side won. By the war's end, Persia was gutted, Byzantium bankrupt, and Syria pulverized. Crops rotted in abandoned fields, towns lay in ruins, and populations were shattered by slavery and flight. The land looked less like a prize and more like a carcass two predators had mauled to death. Chroniclers later compared the conflict to an end-time struggle, an Armageddon before Islam. For those who survived, it must have felt like it. Shrines were desecrated, holy cities defiled, and both empires staggered back from the brink with nothing left in reserve. Syria was less governed than haunted. And so, when Arab armies appeared only a few years later, they didn't face a healthy superpower but two empires already half dead. As one chronicler put it, Byzantium and Persia had fought so long over Syria that they left it like a vineyard stripped bare, ready for the next plunderer. Amid the rubble of war, Syria remained a mosaic. It wasn't one people, one language, or one faith, but a patchwork stitched together by history's roughest hands. Greek-speaking elites ran the cities, Aramaic-speaking peasants tilled the fields, Jews and Christians clashed and coexisted, and Arab tribes lingered on the desert fringes, waiting for their turn at the stage. Damascus embodied this diversity. Its markets overflowed with spices from Arabia, silks from Persia, and grain from its own hinterlands. Greek administrators scribbled in their offices while Aramaic rang in the streets. Devotees passed through its shrines, while merchants hawked goods from 3 continents. It was a city where theology could spark a riot by day, and trade still carried on by night. Edessa, further north, thrived as a center of learning. Its Christian schools taught theology in Syriac, a language closer to the villages than the imperial Greek of Constantinople. The city also produced a stream of apocryphal tales and miracle stories that spread across the Near East. In Edessa, scholarship and superstition often sat side by side, sometimes in the same classroom. Jewish communities also carved out a place in this fractured world. Some sided with Persia during its campaigns, hoping for relief from Byzantine oppression. When Byzantium clawed Syria back, reprisals followed. Synagogues set ablaze, communities scattered, pogroms ordered in the name of loyalty. For Jews in Syria, survival meant navigating imperial suspicion while clinging to their faith. Arab tribes too became part of Syria's social fabric. Some hired themselves out as mercenaries to the Byzantines, others to the Persians, and many drifted between both, loyal only to coin and survival. They grazed flocks on the fringes of settled lands, half outsiders and half insiders, soon to play a far larger role than either empire imagined. The irony of Syria's diversity was that it bred as much rivalry as resilience. The empire wanted unity, but the ground delivered cacophony. Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, and Arabic competed for space in markets and prayers. One chronicler quipped that Damascus was like a tavern where every table argued about God in a different language. And yet, that diversity was also strength. Ideas, goods, and traditions flowed across borders, making Syria a cultural crossroads, even in ruin. Its contradictions, learned cities and starving villages, rival creeds and shared shrines, gave it resilience, even as empires trampled it. Syria survived not by unity, but by fragmentation. By the eve of the Arab conquests, the land was weary but not empty, fractured but not broken. It was a society both vibrant and vulnerable, a patchwork that dazzled from afar but crumbled at the edges when pressed too hard. By the 630s, Syria was a land already staggering. The Roman-Persian death match had left its soil scorched, its treasury drained, and its people weary beyond measure. When Arab armies swept in from the desert, they didn't face a united province bracing for resistance. They found a region hollowed out by centuries of punishment. Religion cracked the foundation. Monophysite Christians, alienated by Constantinople's decrees, had no loyalty to Byzantine orthodoxy. To them, Chalcedon was less revelation than a chain. When Arab armies arrived, many Syrians saw not enemies but an escape from the imperial faith police. Economy was another fracture line. Generations of war and taxation had emptied granaries and buried families in debt. Villages long bled of coin and crops were primed to welcome any power that promised lighter hands, even if that promise was illusion. Militarily, Syria was a husk. The Byzantines staggered back from their Persian wars with exhausted troops, facing opponents who moved faster, struck sharper, and required less. Cities like Damascus and Edessa raised defenses, but loyalty cracked when locals refused to fight for an empire that had never fought for them. The shock lay in the speed of it. Rome and Persia had spent centuries clawing over Syria, but the Arabs secured it in years. Chroniclers marveled that the land didn't so much fall as collapse inward, like a house left unlocked and unattended. Yet disillusionment came quickly. Syrians who expected freedom found new rulers with new tributes. The cross gave way to the crescent, but the burdens, obedience, taxation, subjugation remained. Liberation curdled into continuity. By the mid-7th century, Syria's golden Christian age had ended, not with a dramatic last stand, but with a slow surrender. What toppled the province wasn't conquest alone, but exhaustion. A land so drained that inheritance, not defeat, wrote the final chapter. Syria's so-called Golden Age was never gilded peace. It was a corpse painted with brilliance. Saints perched on pillars until their skin rotted. Emperors revised heaven's script with soldiers, and monks turned relic theft into a profession. Markets swelled with silver for holy bones, while peasants sold their children to survive Byzantine taxes. Syria glittered, but the shine came from firelight on ruins. Its cities became punchlines of history. Damascus doubled as shrine and tax office, Edessa as seminary and relic factory, Emesa as carnival of bones. Antioch, passed back and forth like a cursed heirloom, stood less as a jewel of empire than as proof of how often crowns slipped and shattered. Every layer of life was absurd. Holiness looked like performance art, salvation like a business contract, and theology like a street fight. Faith was meant to bind communities, but in Syria it tore them apart. Monks mutilating rivals, emperors turning churches into bonfires, villagers beaten for flunking Christological trivia. And yet, amid the wreckage, resilience refused to die. Worshippers still flocked to shrines, fields still sprouted grain, sermons still thundered across pulpits. Syria's tragedy was not weakness but endurance. No matter how often it was gutted, someone rebuilt the stall, restocked the reliquary, or replanted the wheat. That tenacity became its curse, chaining it to empires that drained it again and again. By the time Arab armies crossed its borders, Syria wasn't conquered so much as collected. Byzantium and Persia had fought until nothing remained but exhaustion, and into that exhaustion walked a new power with swords in hand. Syria was the golden corpse, dazzling, decayed, and waiting to be claimed. So which was crazier? Saints living like scarecrows in the sky, relics traded like stock options, or emperors moonlighting as theologians with armies? History doesn't give us an answer, but it does give us the ruins of Syria, proof that brilliance and folly can coexist until both collapse. And into that collapse stepped the Arabs, ready to inherit not a golden age, but a corpse still warm.